What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to the channel. Today I have an awesome video for you because we're going to be making this big walnut and epoxy beach board. I had a lot of fun making this project and I hope you enjoy watching the video. Let's go ahead and get started with the build. Since I'm going to be working the rest of the day in the shop, I'm going to do the epoxy pours in the unfinished part of our basement, so that way I can keep dust out of the board. So I poured out about 300 milliliters of epoxy. That's going to give us a base layer of about 3/8 of an inch. I'm going to make sure to stir very, very slowly so I don't introduce any unnecessary air bubbles. I am using Total Boat thickset epoxy. Okay, I'm about to pour my base layer of epoxy. Alright, so about 24 hours later, our first layer of Total Boat thickset epoxy is mostly dry. If I put my fingernail in it, I can definitely make a little dent, so it's not completely hardened yet. The other day, I picked up this little jar of white sand. We're going to use that in our board, and we're going to put some seashells, some sand dollars, starfish on there, and make it look like a cool little scene. Now, before I mix the sand with some of the Total Boat thickset epoxy, I'm going to pour sand in here, kind of make my scene, take a picture of it so I know exactly what I'm going to do when this epoxy is starting to harden. So I'm just pulling things out of the bag right now that I think are going to look nice in the board. Little things that I picked out of the bags. Got some cool little shells, some starfish, and then we also have a sand dollar. So I've pulled out all of the shells that were in our board, and what I'm going to do is pour all of this sand into a mixing cup and then slowly add epoxy until it's the right consistency. Okay, so I'm going to slowly add it and mix it in. I don't really know how much it's going to take, so I definitely don't want to put too much. Okay, so after a couple of minutes of mixing and adding epoxy slowly, we've got this pretty nasty looking paste, but it's really thick. Everything in there is wet, so it's going to work exactly the way I want it to. It's very, very important that all of your sand is nice and wet and coated with epoxy, or else it's not going to dry properly. Okay, so I got all of our little props sitting on top of our sand and epoxy mixture. I've got them all laid out the way that I want them. So now we basically just have to let the epoxy dry. Okay, so our sand and epoxy mixture is pretty much hardened. I can still dig my fingernail into it, and that's good. You want the next layer of epoxy to stick to it. Alright, another 16 ounces of Total Boat Thickset Epoxy. And the hardener. Okay, so it's been about 30 hours since I poured that last layer, and as you can see, it's starting to harden up really nicely. We're going to go ahead and pour probably the final layer. I might need to do one more layer after that, though. So it's been about a week since I poured the final layer of Total Boat Thickset Epoxy on our board. It is completely hardened, very, very nice and flat and clear. So first step is going to be getting this thing out of the mold. So as you can see, we ran our board through the planer. It's nice and flat, but it fogged up all of our epoxy. So this is kind of the part of the process that I was always skeptical about from the beginning. So I decided to go out and buy these nice MicroMesh sanding pads. I have used the little 2" by 2" MicroMesh squares on another clear epoxy board. It worked pretty well, not great. So I got the ones that go on the random orbit sander, hoping that these would do a lot better job. I'm going to start using the MicroMesh pads here. They are not on the same grit scale as regular sandpaper, which makes it kind of weird. But just feeling the roughest grit, it's really, really fine. I mean, I would say this is at least a 2,000 grit piece of sandpaper. I forget what this is on the MicroMesh scale, but like I said, 2,000 grit roughly on real sandpaper scale, and then it just goes all the way up until you get to like ones like this that are just, there's no grit. You can't even feel it. So I have some pretty high hopes for this stuff, and I really hope it makes this board look really nice and clear. I'm not sure if you remember what this looks like before we did the MicroMesh, but this is just after the very first grit of MicroMesh. You can already see how good this looks, and this doesn't have any finish or anything on it. So we still have 9 more grits to go, and this is only going to get better and better and better. So we applied a pretty heavy coat of walrus oil on the board. Directions say to let it sit for 12 hours and then wipe off the excess, so that's exactly what we're going to do. But I really am liking the grain in that walnut. I also noticed these nice, really cool blonde streaks going right through the heartwood of the walnut on both pieces. Thought that was pretty neat. And I really like the way that the walnut starts out dark and kind of fades to the sapwood and then fades down into the sand. Guys, I really hope you enjoyed this week's project. I had so much fun making this. It was such an adventure getting the walnut and pouring the base layer of epoxy, mixing the sand with the epoxy, and then it was super fun putting all of the different items down in there and then watching them get encapsulated in the epoxy. Like I said, the board is 20 inches by 13 inches by 1.5 inches. I got the sand and the shells from Michael's, the craft store. I got the sand dollar while we were snorkeling in the Bahamas, and the sand also came from Michael's. If you're not already subscribed to the channel, make sure that you go ahead and get subscribed to the channel. Also, make sure that you hit the notification bell so you get notified whenever I post a new video. If you're not already following me on Instagram, make sure that you go ahead and follow me on Instagram, Seth's Custom Creations. I'll put the name on the screen there for you. I post a lot of behind-the-scenes stuff and stuff that doesn't get put up on my YouTube channel over on my Instagram. And if you're following me on Instagram, you already know about this board. I've been kind of working on it for a while, posting a lot of pictures about it. I also do a lot of giveaways over on my Instagram, so you're definitely not going to want to miss out. And lastly, check out my website. I've got some products on there, more information about me, and some other stuff you might like. So I'll leave a link in the description box down below so you can go check out my website. I'll see you guys next week.